I'm going to be at a very different level of abstraction, I think, than many of the talks. I'm not going to have nice stories to tell you, or pictures, or anecdotes even. I'm just going to sort of reflect on a few broader issues in economic science, social science, whatever, that came to my mind when I was thinking about the title of this workshop. I should say I don't do research in this area. I don't really reflect on it very often, but I have sort of three hats. One as a researcher here in Manchester, one as one of the research directors at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which does an awful lot of economic policy advice and commentary, and I want to talk about the role of commentary versus research. And a third hat is as one of the principal investigators of a big social survey, where we're actually collecting data and sort of releasing data for researchers on large samples of individuals into the public archives. So I want to sort of think about those kind of things, really. These overheads are as much for my benefit, I'm afraid, as for yours. They're just really a sort of marker on where we're going. I want to group my comments into four broad areas. We'll have talked about things already, I think, this morning. Some of them are really blindingly obvious, but I just want to put them up there as a way of facilitating subsequent debate and conclusions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this issue of values and positive versus normative judgments in economics. I want to talk about the sort of spectrum with research at one end and advocacy at the other end and how we think about that. I want to talk about the use and abuse, in particular, of statistical evidence. I think economics has gone some way to try and address that. And I want to talk about some practical considerations, many of which you will have more experience of than I will, but you might not have known that economists are sort of playing in that sandpit as well. I've only got one slide on each. So here's my question. Does socially responsible economic research require the avoidance of value judgments? And most economists would say yes, it does. Most economists would set themselves up as positive, scientists. There is a branch, of course, of normative economics, and there's, the large amount of conventional, certainly the kind of economics that I do at the Institute here at Manchester says no. Modern economics, if it's going to be responsible, has to be value-free. You have to separate the values from the science. Now, that is rather challenging for exactly the reasons that Angela was talking about just now, because the question is, well, if you can't have value judgments, what have you got? And so I think economists have gone down a little bit of a route to try and provide what they've got in the absence. I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. You can characterize key parameters of the behaviors, of the organizational interactions, key pieces of evidence on unknowns on which sort of consequential judgments about research, about the implications of research could be made when combined with a value judgment. You can document mechanisms and market failures. So that would be, you can say, well, if I can show that there's something that's going wrong in the market or in the relationship between a firm and a consumer or a government and a particular part of the electorate, if I can show that's going wrong in theory, then that provides a rationale for intervention regardless of whatever set of values you have. And that relates to, I think, this thing that we talk about quite a lot now, although it's unfortunately doesn't really get you out of as many holes as you think it would do, which is this idea of dominance criteria. And economists have worked quite a lot on this, is that sometimes you can say that whatever one's value judgments, A is always a better thing than B. And a sort of classic case in point would be, the sort of stereotypical example we teach in sort of first or second year welfare economics, is whether or not more inequality is a good or a bad thing. Okay? Now, you won't find a credible piece of economics that would say the answer to that question. Because there's usually some particular welfare function that weights the good of one person versus the other that could justify an equilibrium with more inequality, and there's another set of welfare functions that can justify an equilibrium with less. Consequently, without making a value judgment about which one of those kind of welfare functions you prefer, you can't really make a normative statement about whether more inequality is good. And you might say, well, isn't that ridiculous? Economists just don't want to go where the rest of us want to be. But I could tell you a very coherent story where inequality represents the opportunity for people to get returns on their innovation. That is dynamically efficient in the long run for an economy. The whole, the story about trickle down and all this sort of stuff. It's very hard to actually empirically sort of test or disprove that. Ultimately, that's going to rest on the values. And so these kind of dominance criteria say that in some situations, there are particular policies or particular conclusions of research that you can say, no matter whether you believe, whatever welfare function you had, you can always say this conclusion is better. And we've worked on that as a discipline, and one tries to use these things whenever you can. But of course, unfortunately, most of the time you can't. So then the question is, well, what do we do? And I'll return to that a little bit at the end. I mean, even, I think, documenting the value judgments that one would have to support the conclusion that this is a good outcome is, I think, a major step forward relative to what I see in a lot of social research. And I would include economics in that as well. I don't, economists, I think, have thought about this, and there's as much bad economics in all these dimensions that I'm about to say as there is bad everything else. Another classic case, I do quite a lot on this, are individuals saving enough for their retirement? We had a whole lot about it yesterday. Almost everybody sort of would think yes, but I could write you down a very, very sensible model that says, well, you can't answer that without making an implicit value about individuals' preference for their own consumption. I speak to the Department of Work and Pensions and the ministers who are always trying to encourage people to save more. I say, well, okay, you want people to save more. Are you willing to look a poor person in the eye and tell them you want them to spend less? Because unless you're willing to do that, then everything else, is a sideshow. They might be going into debt in order to finance pension contributions. You can't say that's good. There's all these things that might be going on. And, at that point they say, oh, well, maybe I'm less willing to encourage them to save more, because confronted with those kind of decisions. So these things are sort of everywhere in economic policy analysis. And it's very rare that sort of dominance criteria gets us out of it. So one has to then think, well, what do we do? And this relates a little bit to what Angela was talking about. And I think, at some point, this also relates to this dimension here that I'm going to which is this continuum with sort of research and advocacy at either end and sort of commentary in the middle. We hear our great university colleagues sort of pronouncing on whatever, Big Brother or the news or whatever about, the implications of their research for some particular situation. So I thought it's worth thinking about these two things. So I think it's one of these things where you sort of know what it is when we see it, but it's quite hard to write it down. This is my characterization of research. The researcher sort of puts himself up here, and this is a logical and. So he or she has to put together assumptions and data to facilitate conclusions or inferences. And I would stress that, economic theory, economic modelling, so you can't do this without both of these. Data alone are not sufficient to make inference. Assumptions alone, or by assumptions I mean theory, because theory is just a rewrite of our assumptions, are also not sufficient. So now of course that's the sort of scientific method, really, the empirical scientific method, and we sort of know about that. Recharacterizing this little picture into advocacy, I'd sort of put advocacy like this. The researcher puts himself down here with the conclusions, and then this and becomes an or. And so the researcher then says, well, what set of assumptions or data justify my conclusions? And we heard a little bit about that in Paul's reflections on the debate about emergency relief. He was saying, well, we have a conclusion that we need to send teams into these disaster areas, and we're looking for either assumptions or data that will sort of justify that, or rather, we're not looking for data that would refute that. So, this would be, thinking about the three kind of core pillars of our trade, assumptions, data, and conclusions. It's no doubt about it, really, in my mind, that advocacy kind of looks a bit like this. Now, I should say, there's a lot of advocacy going around calling itself research. In economics and in every other social science, and in fact in a lot of other medical sciences. I work a lot with health epidemiologists, and I hear huge amounts of value judgments all the time along the lines, well, if the world were a more equal place, health would be better. Or if there were fewer poor people in the world, there'll be less disease. And I don't see any evidence, and I read and write in those scientific health journals, I don't see any evidence that adheres to this criteria of proof for any of those statements. So I don't mind professors or other researchers putting out their value judgments based on their experience of their own values and their own evidence, but I don't want that to be called research. I want it to be called advocacy. Now, in the middle of this rather abstract little thing, there's no picture for this, because there's this issue of commentary. And we deal with this a lot at the Institute, but I think in particular now researchers are being asked to deal with it much more in this culture of impact and user engagement that I'm going to return to at the end. We're being come to and asked for our view on things, or we're encouraged to talk about things outside of our research. And I think there's a new set of issues around responsible policy commentary. Now, when there's firm evidence, one can make statements, of course. I think my view is responsible commentary should, at the very least, state where evidence is weak. And avoid, preferably, but if not, you can't avoid, identify value judgments. I spoke to one policymaker a few months ago, and he said, well, as long as he knew what people thought, he'd be able to interpret what they say. So, he was a sort of Tory, so he would say that, or this, And at some point, he was sort of saying, well, actually, politically aligned think tanks, you can interpret a little bit what they say. If Demos says this, you can say, well, okay, I can filter that through the lens of what, So if at least value judgments are identified, their role in the inferences can be made. But this is, this once again is a rather high bar, I think, because quite often when we're asked to discuss things, firm evidence on that particular thing doesn't exist, either because data is not there or because assumptions are not sufficient to justify conclusions. So what do you do if rigorous evidence is irrelevant and relevant evidence is not rigorous? And what we do at the Institute is we don't comment. But, or we go about getting better evidence. But again, this is a high bar. It's very hard, I'm going to argue, for academics now to do this. There's pressure from our institutions, from our funders, and from the media to go down this route with our commentary and our research. I think my view is part of social responsibility is to make sure, and this I think is one of my final things, is that we retain the same scientific rigor with our commentary as we do, or at least we try and do with our research. I'm going to go very briefly over statistics because I don't want to spend too much time on this. There is a serious issue, I think, about poor quality statistics and poor quality inference in social science. Part of it just relates to inappropriate inferences, survey designs without appropriate power or samples, repeatedly confusion of statistical significance and the magnitude of an effect. We hear all the time people talking about an effect being important, meaning it's got a statistical significance of something. It could be quantifiably minute, it could be huge. Very few people talk about the magnitude of effects. There's also a huge amount, I think, of inaccuracy in people making inferences about populations for whom it's really inappropriate given the study. We have small interventions in particular things, like to what extent are inferences generalizable? There's a serious set of statistical issues around this. And economists as well as everybody else are equally bad at overstepping the mark on all these occasions. One thing that I think is creeping into analysis, which is a good thing, not a bad thing, and is this idea of bounds. And this returns to something that Penny said in her introductory remarks this morning, actually, which is that even something like correct statistical inference, confidence intervals, and what have you, can suggest spurious precision if your parameter of interest depends on some identifying assumptions which may be open to debate. So, I might make an assumption that, I don't know, all men earn £10 a week. And given that assumption, £10 an hour, given that assumption, I can get a conclusion, I can get a parameter with a certain view thing and a confidence interval I can make. No, but, I might well want to see how is the dependence of that result on that particular assumption. So now I think some economists, and I'm particularly influenced here by a guy from Northwestern called Chuck Mansky, who's written a great paper for those who are interested called Policy Analysis with Incredible Certitude, which is all about how policymakers demand infeasible certitude from scientists and put us in difficult situations. And he has many, many demonstrations of scientists responding to that by doing things which are really, really inappropriate. But he talks a lot about the fact in his work, and he alludes to it in the final section of this paper, that we are able sometimes to put bounds on effects. If we thought the world was like this, our estimate of the effect would be that. If we thought the world was like that, it might be this. Again, it's akin to this dominance criteria. Sometimes we can say that whatever your set of values, something, some qualitative result will follow. So we can also sometimes say that whatever your particular assumptions or your theory, some things will follow. Sometimes your results will depend on a particular assumption. It's important to know that. So I put all this in under statistical rigor. But really this is as much about modelling as it is about statistics per se. I've got some practical considerations before I wrap up. As Angela said, economists are now very involved in designing and analysing experiments and interventions. We are running randomised experiments in schools, we being the Institute of Fiscal Studies and also economists outside in Britain and all over the world. Randomised experiments where we're sort of taking pupils and giving them, taking a random sample of pupils in a class and offering them money if they stay to their A-levels and not to a control group. There are interventions in developing countries, sort of conditional cash transfer programs where sort of mothers are, there's control groups of mothers who are offered inoculations for their children and treatment groups that are offered inoculations, but they only get the inoculations if they get a conditional sort of fee of $100 or whatever if they participate in the program. There are many of these interventions going on, and economists are now dealing with exactly the same of ethical and social responsibility issues in those interventions that I was hearing about so much this morning. Of course, being economists, we're much more willing to sort of separate our values. So we say, oh, well, we're researchers, thinking as I was, reflecting on this issue about when you're in a poor village and someone's, going to miss the meal, what do you do about it, and I would sit there and think, well, that's a personal decision, I'll take exactly the same decision about that as if I would if I was confronted with a poor person in Manchester who came up to me in the street. What I do as a researcher is what we're talking about here. What I do as a person, I think, is different, I do whatever I want. And I think, so that's, as I say, that's a typical economist sort of divorcing of the values from the theory. And it's just struck to me, certainly some of the issues I think in terms of what we were hearing about this morning probably are not discussed in terms of the interventions that are going on in developing countries. But some of them that I think you may not have discussed in social science are, like for example, the medical rule on intervention, which is as soon as you know something is either harming or not harming, one has to stop the trial. And there's the theory, you're always updating your evidence, at what point does it become statistical significance? Those things are seriously discussed. All these things are much more, I would argue, ethically reviewed than a typical social survey. So we are already in that ball game, and I think that is good for, again, that reflects well on the science. We're doing an awful lot of work on survey design. I was amazed to hear that you could even think about not paying respondents for being in research. We have an ethics committee on the survey we design, we always have. And they sometimes try, and I was saying to Angela at lunch, they try and argue that us paying our respondents is coercive. We're somehow coercing them into participating in our research. And I in my response to the ethics committee, I asked them if they think that their employer is coercing them to work by offering them a wage for the hours that they put in. And needless to say, we usually get allowed to ask to give an incentive. There are a set of issues we haven't talked about responsible use of data. I don't want to go into it here in much detail, but social science and economics in particular has been very, very strong on the public release of microdata. And I would argue social responsibility implies making your results replicatable. And replicatable implies releasing your data to the public. Because I don't think science is socially responsible if it's not replicatable, because I think it hinders subsequent debate of whatever conclusions from the science is drawn. So we have this argument in the medical literature, because of course the medical data is often not released, and we might talk about it more, but certainly within economics and within social science there's a strong movement. All data must be put in the archive such that other scientists can potentially refute it, the debate can move on, and actually you can have a quality debate about the kind of issues I've been talking about. Of course, we're also working with very sensitive data. I'm working with tax records of 50,000 people in Britain. I'm working with genetic and biological markers of samples of 20,000. So there are other sets of ethical issues that we have to think about in terms of disclosiveness of data, privacy, getting appropriate consent for respondents, for researchers to be able to use these data. And I think, I'm not going to go on about them here because I think that's an area I think maybe Angela and Penny may disagree that. I think there is a rather well-documented playing, sort of set of things that one needs to be discussed. Okay, my last slide, I think. conclusion. So this is what I've said. Conclusion: socially responsible economic research, free of value judgments. That's my view. You might find an economist who might argue differently. Clear about the role of assumptions and models. That I think is where good economics stands out, and I don't see very much of this in other social sciences. I see a lot of, sometimes you do, but I sometimes see particular assumptions being drawn out as part of a theoretical structure. I often don't see every assumption being drawn out. And economists get a bad name because we're sort of thought about, spending our time modelling these entirely ridiculous situations that are so far from reality that they're not relevant. But that's because we say every single assumption under which our effects can be estimated as causal. And I think if you did the same for many other problems, you'd find it's equally small set of situations. Statistically rigorous, I think we also heard this morning something about the basic principle of do no harm. So where do we end up with all this? Well, we end up, I also say, dissemination, and I think this is an important point, has to adhere to the same principles. And this is where we have particularly the challenge now, this is my note to contribute to the day, is that the new era of impact and user engagement that we're put into by our funders has sort of placed us with a set of pressures that sometimes go against maybe these more scientific principles. I've put here policymakers and media, but I could also include funders, demand and indeed incentivize rather different behaviour from researchers. And of course I'm an economist, and if an economist could say two words, they'd say incentives matter. And it's no surprise at all to me that when people are put in a situation where they're incentivized to make statements that do not meet these criteria, they end up making them. And I think that's the biggest challenge for me in the kind of work that I do, is to sort of participate in discussion, to promote research, to commentate on economic policy, and still make sure that you can be sort of true to this sort of set of more scientific values, which you may or may not hold, but they're the ones I think that most economists would sort of try and adhere to. I think that's a really difficult issue, and I'm in favour of sort of trying to stand up for science in the face of this. I'm not saying I'm anti-commentary, I'm certainly not anti-user engagement, but I want, as a scientist, to say, this is what I know, this is where what I know ends. If you want to ask me what I think as a person, you can ask me as well, although bear in mind Richard Feynman's famous quote that he says a scientist, when not talking about scientists, is just as dumb as anyone else. So I think we have to be very careful about saying what we know from what we think.